The morning sun painted the canyon walls gold as James Patterson guided his horse along the rocky trail. He had been riding for 3 days straight, searching for the perfect spot to set up his photography equipment. As a documentary photographer from back east, James wanted to capture the untamed beauty of the Arizona territory for the folks in New York who had never seen such wild landscapes. The sound of rushing water grew louder as he approached the canyon's edge. Below, white rapids crashed against smooth boulders, creating a misty spray that caught the sunlight like diamonds. James dismounted and pulled his heavy camera equipment from the saddlebags. This would be the perfect shot for his collection. As he set up his tripod near the cliff's edge, a movement in the water below caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a deer coming to drink, but when he looked more carefully through his camera lens, his breath caught in his throat. A young woman was swimming in the dangerous rapids, her long black hair flowing behind her like silk ribbons. She moved through the churning water with incredible skill, diving beneath the surface and emerging again with the grace of a river spirit. James had never seen anything so beautiful or so dangerous. The woman wore simple leather clothing that marked her as Apache. James knew he should look away, respect her privacy, but he found himself frozen. Watching her dance with the deadly current, she seemed to belong to the water itself, as natural as the fish and as fearless as the hawks that soared overhead. Suddenly, she turned and looked directly at him. Even from this distance, James could see her dark eyes flash with surprise and then anger. She had spotted him watching her. James fumbled with his camera, his hands shaking as he tried to pack it away quickly. The young woman swam to the shore with powerful strokes and climbed onto the rocks. She stood there for a moment, water dripping from her hair and clothes, staring up at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she disappeared into the thick brush that lined the riverbank. James's heart pounded as he finished packing his equipment. He had violated something sacred, he realized. The woman had been alone in what was probably a special place for her people, and he had intruded like a common spy. Shame washed over him as he mounted his horse and rode away from the canyon, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. That night, as he camped under the stars, the image of the Apache woman in the rapids haunted his dreams. Her graceful movements, her fierce eyes, the way she had belonged so completely to that wild place. James had traveled across the country photographing natural wonders, but nothing had moved him like this mysterious woman. The next morning, James rode back to the canyon. He told himself he needed more photographs, but deep down he hoped to see her again. He set up his camera at a respectful distance from the water and began taking pictures of the landscape. Hours passed with no sign of the woman. Just as he was about to give up, he heard the soft sound of moccasins on stone behind him. James turned slowly, his heart racing. The Apache woman stood 10 feet away, watching him with those same dark eyes. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he had remembered. Her face was strong and proud, with high cheekbones and full lips. She looked to be about 20 years old, though there was a wisdom in her eyes that seemed much older. "You came back," she said in perfect English, surprising him. "I wanted to apologize," James replied, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to spy on you yesterday. I was just taking photographs, and I saw you in the water. I should have looked away." The woman studied him for a long moment. "You are the picture man. We have heard about you in our village. You capture the spirits of places in your black box." James shook his head quickly. "No, it's not like that. I just record what I see, to show people back east how beautiful this land is." "My name is Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "What do they call you, picture man?" "James Patterson. I'm from New York." Ayana nodded. "You are very far from home." "James Patterson from New York. What brings you to Apache land?" "Beauty," James said honestly. "I've never seen anything as beautiful as this place, or as you yesterday in the rapids." A small smile played at the corners of Ayana's mouth. "The spirits of the water called to me yesterday. They do not call often, but when they do, I must answer. It is a sacred time for my people." James felt his face burn with shame again. I'm so sorry I interrupted something sacred. I didn't understand. The spirits were not angry, Ayana said, surprising him. If they had been, you would have fallen from that cliff. Instead, they let you see. Perhaps there is a reason. They stood in silence for a moment, the sound of the rapids filling the space between them. James wanted to ask her so many questions, but he didn't want to offend her further. Would you like to see how I make the pictures? James asked finally. I promise it doesn't capture spirits. It's just a machine that records light. Ayana's eyes lit up with curiosity. Show me. James set up his camera and explained how it worked, how the light came through the lens and created an image on the glass plate. Ayana listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed her quick intelligence. May I try? She asked. James hesitated. The camera equipment was expensive and delicate, but something in Ayana's eyes made him trust her completely. Of course. He showed her how to look through the viewfinder and adjust the focus. Ayana's hands were steady and sure as she operated the camera. She took her time, studying the landscape through the lens. I see now, she said softly. You are trying to catch the soul of this place and take it with you. Something like that, James agreed. But the soul cannot be caught in a machine, Ayana said, lowering the camera to look at him. It must be felt in here. She placed her hand over her heart. James stared at her, struck by the simple wisdom of her words. You're right. The photographs are just shadows compared to the real thing. Then why do you make them? Because not everyone can come here to see for themselves. Maybe if they see the shadows, they'll want to protect the real thing. Ayana considered this. That is a good reason, but dangerous too. If too many people come, they will destroy what you seek to protect. They spent the rest of the afternoon together. Ayana showed James hidden pools where colorful fish swam, and ancient caves where her ancestors had drawn pictures on the walls. In return, James told her about the great cities back east, with their tall buildings and crowded streets. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls deep red and orange, Ayana grew quiet. I must return to my village, she said finally. Will I see you again? James asked, surprised by how much the thought of losing her hurt. Ayana looked at him for a long moment. That depends on many things. James Patterson from New York. My people do not trust outsiders easily, and there are some in my village who would see our meeting today as betrayal. What do you mean? I am promised to another. Dakota, the son of our war chief. The wedding has been arranged since we were children. If he knew I had spent the day with a white man, alone. She shuddered. James felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. You're engaged? Not by my choice, Ayana said quickly, but by the choice of my father and his. It is the way of our people. The marriage will unite two powerful families. And what about what you want? Ayana's eyes flashed. What I want does not matter. I am a woman. I must do my duty to my family and my tribe. But James could see the pain in her eyes, the longing for something more. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Ayana said firmly. The ceremony is in 1 moon's time. After that, I will be Dakota's wife and the mother of his children. I will never see you again. The finality in her voice cut through James like a knife. Ayana, she held up her hand to stop him. Do not say what you are thinking, James Patterson. It can only lead to sorrow for both of us. But as she turned to leave, James saw her wipe away a tear. She felt something for him too, he realized. The connection he had felt was real. Ayana, wait, he called after her. She stopped but didn't turn around. If you don't want to marry him, if you want something different for your life, then maybe we can find a way. Now, she did turn, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You do not understand. If I refuse this marriage, I will bring shame on my family. My father will be dishonored. And Dakota, he is not a man who accepts rejection well. He would find a way to punish not just me, but anyone who stood in his way. Are you trying to warn me away? I am trying to protect you, Ayana said softly. And myself. This feeling between us, it is like a fire in dry grass. It will consume everything if we let it. James took a step toward her. Maybe some things are worth the risk. Ayanna stared at him, her breathing quickening. For a moment, James thought she might run to him. But then she shook her head firmly. Go back to your New York, James Patterson. Find a proper white woman to marry, and forget you ever saw an Apache girl in the rapids. With that, she turned and disappeared into the brush, leaving James alone with the sound of rushing water and the ache of something he had found and lost in the same day. But James couldn't forget. Over the next several days, he found excuses to return to the canyon. He never saw Ayanna again. But he felt her presence everywhere. He took more photographs, but none of them captured what he really wanted: to preserve the memory of her grace, her intelligence, her fierce spirit. On the 5th day, as James was packing up his equipment, he heard horses approaching. 3 Apache men rode into the clearing, their faces painted for war. The leader was tall and powerfully built, with cruel eyes and a mouth set in a permanent sneer. This had to be Dakota. You are the white man who makes pictures, Dakota said in heavily accented English. I am, James replied, trying to keep his voice steady. You have been seen in our territory many times. What do you seek here? Just photographs of the landscape. I'm documenting the natural beauty of this region. Dakota's eyes narrowed. Nothing else? James met his gaze steadily. Nothing else. Good, Dakota said with a cold smile. Because if I find that you have been seeking anything or anyone else, it will not go well for you. Do you understand? Picture man? The threat was clear. Somehow, Dakota suspected something about James and Ayanna, even though they had only met once. James nodded slowly. I understand perfectly. Then we will not see you in this canyon again, Dakota said. It wasn't a request. As the 3 Apache men rode away, James realized that Ayanna had been right to warn him. The situation was more dangerous than he had understood. Dakota was clearly a violent man who would not hesitate to hurt anyone he saw as a threat to his claim on Ayanna. But instead of frightening James away, the encounter only made him more determined. Ayanna was trapped in a life she didn't want, facing marriage to a man who terrified even hardened warriors. She had spent one afternoon showing him kindness and sharing her wisdom, and now James couldn't bear the thought of her suffering. As he rode back toward the town where he was staying, James began to form a plan. It was dangerous, maybe even foolish. But some things were worth any risk. James spent the next week in the small frontier town of Copper Creek, but his mind was always on Ayanna and the impossible situation she faced. He tried to focus on developing his photographs in the makeshift darkroom he had set up in his hotel room, but every image of the canyon reminded him of her graceful figure moving through the rapids. The townspeople were curious about the Easterner who spent his days making pictures of rocks and trees. At the saloon, James struck up conversations with traders, cowboys, and anyone who might know something about the Apache tribes in the area. That's Chief Running Bear's daughter you're asking about, said an old trader named Murphy over a glass of whiskey. Prettiest girl in the whole territory, they say. But she's spoken for. Going to marry Dakota, Running Bear's nephew. That boy's meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache. What's he like, this Dakota? James asked, trying to sound casual. Murphy spat into the sawdust on the floor. Killed his first man when he was 16. Been collecting scalps ever since. Apache and white alike. Story goes, he once tortured a cavalry soldier for 3 days just for sport. Running Bear keeps him in line mostly, but when the old chief dies, Dakota'll likely take over the tribe. And God help anyone who crosses him then. James's blood ran cold. The more he learned about Dakota, the more desperate he became to find a way to help Ayanna escape her fate. Course, the girl might not mind, Murphy continued. Apache women are taught to obey from birth. She'll probably be grateful to have such a strong warrior for a husband. What if she wasn't grateful? James asked carefully. What if an Apache woman refused an arranged marriage? Murphy laughed bitterly. Refuse? An Apache woman refuse her father's choice? That don't happen, friend. If it did, she'd bring shame on her whole family. They'd likely cast her out, leave her to die in the desert. No Apache would take her in after that. James left the saloon with a heavy heart. Every avenue seemed to lead to disaster for Ayanna. If she married Dakota, she would be trapped with a cruel man for the rest of her life. If she refused, she would lose her family and her place in the only world she had ever known. But James couldn't give up. The next morning, he rode out toward the Apache village, staying well hidden in the rocks and brush. He had no plan, just a desperate need to see Ayanna again, to let her know she wasn't alone in her struggle. The Apache camp was situated in a protected valley, with about 30 teepees arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. James watched from a ridge above as people went about their daily activities. Children played games while women worked on crafts and prepared food. Men sat in groups, talking and smoking pipes. Then he saw her. Ayanna emerged from one of the larger teepees, carrying a water jug toward the stream that ran along one edge of the camp. Even from a distance, James could see the sadness in her posture. Her usual graceful confidence seemed diminished, as if a great weight pressed down on her shoulders. As she knelt by the stream to fill her jug, Dakota appeared beside her. James couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Dakota's possessive gestures. The way he grabbed Ayanna's arm when she tried to move away. Ayanna kept her eyes down, submissive, but James could see the tension in her body. Dakota said something that made Ayanna flinch. Then he grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. Even from his hiding place, James could see the fear in her eyes. Dakota laughed and walked away, leaving Ayanna alone by the stream. She sat there for a long moment, her hands shaking as she held the water jug. Then she looked up toward the ridge where James was hidden. Their eyes met across the distance, and James saw her mouth form a silent no. She was warning him to stay away, to leave before he was discovered, but James had seen enough. He couldn't stand by and watch the woman he was falling in love with be terrorized by the man she was supposed to marry. That night, as he lay in his bedroll under the stars, James made a decision that would change everything. The next day, James rode to the trading post at Mesa Verde, where white men and Apache sometimes met to exchange goods. He asked around until he found someone who could deliver a message to Chief Running Bear's camp. "You want to send a message to the Apache?" asked the trader, a weathered man named Carson. "That's risky business, friend. What's so important it can't wait?" "It's about photography," James lied smoothly. "I want to ask permission to document their traditional wedding ceremony. For historical purposes." Carson shrugged. "Your funeral. I'll send my boy with the message, but don't expect a warm welcome. The Apache don't much like outsiders poking around their sacred rituals." James wrote his message carefully, knowing that every word had to be perfect. He addressed it to Chief Running Bear, requesting a meeting to discuss photographing the upcoming wedding. But hidden in the formal language was a coded message for Ayanna. He mentioned the eternal blossoms that grew near the rapids, hoping she would understand that he was thinking of her and the meaning of her name. 3 days later, Carson's boy returned with a reply. Chief Running Bear would grant the white photographer an audience, but only for a few minutes, and under strict guard. The meeting would take place at sunset near the sacred spring, a neutral location between the Apache camp and the white settlement. James's heart pounded as he prepared for the meeting. He had no real plan beyond seeing Ayanna again and somehow conveying that he hadn't forgotten her. But as he rode toward the spring, he began to form the outline of something more dangerous and desperate. Chief Running Bear was waiting with 3 warriors when James arrived at the spring. The chief was an imposing man in his 60s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. One of the warriors was Dakota, who watched James with undisguised hostility. "You wish to make pictures of our sacred ceremony?" Chief Running Bear asked in English. "Yes, sir," James replied respectfully. "I believe your people's traditions should be preserved for future generations to understand and respect." The chief studied him for a long moment. "You speak of respect, but respect requires understanding. Do you understand what this marriage means to our people?" "I understand it unites 2 important families," James said carefully. "It does more than that," Chief Running Bear said. "It ensures the survival of our tribe." Dakota is our strongest warrior. My daughter will bear his children, and those children will carry our blood and our traditions forward. This is bigger than any one person's desires. James felt his heart sink. The chief was making it clear that Ayanna's personal feelings were irrelevant to the larger needs of the tribe. However, the chief continued, I will allow you to observe the ceremony from a distance. You may make your pictures, but you will not interfere in any way. Do you understand? I understand, James said, though inside he was screaming in frustration. As the meeting concluded and James prepared to leave, he noticed movement in the brush nearby. For just a moment, he caught a glimpse of Ayanna watching from her hiding place. Their eyes met again, and this time he saw something new in her expression: desperation. That night, as James made camp near the spring, he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Ayanna stepping into the firelight, her face pale with fear and determination. You should not have come, she whispered, glancing around nervously. I had to see you again, James said, standing up. I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop thinking about you. It is too dangerous. If Dakota finds out, then let's make sure he doesn't find out, James said urgently. Ayanna, I've been thinking about your situation. There might be a way. She shook her head frantically. There is no way. The ceremony is in 5 days. After that, I will belong to Dakota forever. Not if you're already married to someone else. Ayanna stared at him in shock. What are you saying? Marry me, James said, taking her hands in his. Tonight. Right now. We can have a simple ceremony here by the spring. It won't be legal in your father's eyes, but it will be real in God's eyes. And then maybe we can find a way to make it legal in the white man's world too. You're insane, Ayanna breathed. Do you know what you're suggesting? If I marry you, I will be cast out from my people forever. And Dakota will hunt you down and kill you slowly. He is not the kind of man who forgives or forgets. I know the risks, James said. But Ayanna, I love you. I know we've only known each other for a short time. But what I feel for you is real. I can't bear the thought of you being trapped with that monster. Tears streamed down Ayanna's face. You don't understand what you're asking. To leave my people would be like cutting out my heart. They are everything to me, my family, my history, my identity. Then don't leave them, James said desperately. We'll find another way. Maybe your father will accept our marriage if we present it as a done thing. Maybe he'll see that forcing you to marry Dakota would only bring violence and sorrow. Ayanna pulled her hands free and stepped back. My father will never accept this. And even if he did, do you think Dakota would simply walk away? He has been promised me since childhood. His pride, his honor, everything depends on this marriage happening as planned. So what are you saying? That we should just give up? That you should resign yourself to a life of misery with a man you fear? I am saying that some battles cannot be won, Ayanna said sadly. James stared at her, seeing the defeat in her eyes. There's something else, isn't there? Something you're not telling me. Ayanna hesitated, then nodded slowly. 3 days ago, Dakota came to my father with news. He had been watching you, following you. He knows about our meeting at the canyon. Dakota. James's blood turned to ice. What exactly does he know? He saw us together that day. He knows we talked, that I showed you around. He doesn't know what we said to each other, but he suspects the worst. And what did your father say? He was furious. He asked me directly if I had developed feelings for you. Ayanna's voice broke. I denied it, of course. But I don't think he believed me. Hi. James understood now why Ayanna seemed so hopeless. She was already under suspicion. Any further contact with him would only make things worse. That's why you have to trust me, James said urgently. If they already suspect something, then we have nothing left to lose by making it true. Marry me tonight, and we'll face whatever comes together. You don't understand, Ayanna whispered. Dakota didn't just tell my father what he saw. He made a threat. If he discovers any further contact between us, he won't just kill you, he'll kill my younger brother as well, to punish my family for failing to control me." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Your brother? Little Hawk. He's only 14 years old. He hero worships you, actually. He's fascinated by your camera and your stories about the big cities. Dakota knows this, and he's threatened to kill him if he catches us together again." James sank down onto a rock, the full weight of the situation finally clear to him. It wasn't just Ayanna's life at stake, or even his own. An innocent boy would pay the price for their love. "Now you see why there is no escape," Ayanna said softly. "I will marry Dakota in 5 days, and you will leave this territory forever. It is the only way to keep the people I love safe." But even as she spoke these words of resignation, James could see the pain in her eyes. She didn't want to give up any more than he did. "There has to be another way," he insisted. "Some solution we haven't thought of yet." Ayanna shook her head. "I have thought of everything. Believe me, I have lain awake every night since our first meeting, trying to find a path that doesn't lead to disaster. There is none." James stood up and moved closer to her. "What if we could get your brother away from the camp? Get him somewhere safe before we made our move?" "Impossible. Dakota watches our family constantly now. And even if we could, where would we take him? He's just a boy. He can't survive on his own in the white man's world. I have friends back east, people who would help, friends who would take in an Apache boy, who would raise him as their own." Ayanna's voice was skeptical. "Yes," James said firmly, though he wasn't entirely sure this was true. "Good people who believe in doing what's right, regardless of race." For the first time, Ayanna looked uncertain rather than defeated. "You truly believe this?" "I do. And I believe that if we work together, we can find a way to save all of us. You, me, and your brother." Ayanna was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. James held his breath, waiting for her answer. Finally, she looked up at him with something that might have been hope. "If, and I mean if we were to attempt such a thing, it would have to be perfect. One mistake, and we're all dead." James felt his heart leap. She was actually considering it. "Tell me about your brother," he said. "His habits, his routines." "He helps tend the horses in the morning, before the sun is fully up. He takes them to graze in the meadow beyond the hill. He's usually alone for about an hour. And the wedding ceremony? Where will it take place?" "At the sacred grove, about a mile from the camp. Everyone will be there. It's the most important event of the season." James's mind raced, putting together the pieces of a plan. What if, during the ceremony, your brother simply didn't return from tending the horses? What if he disappeared? Dakota would suspect immediately that I was involved. Not if you were at the ceremony, in full view of everyone. Not if you seemed as shocked and worried as everyone else when he didn't come back. Ayanna stared at him. "You're suggesting that you take my brother while I'm getting married to another man?" I'm suggesting that we make it look like your brother ran away on his own, maybe because he was upset about your marriage. It happens young people sometimes flee when they're emotional. The search parties would assume he went deeper into Apache territory, not toward the white settlements. And then, after a suitable period of time, maybe a few weeks, you discover that you can't live with Dakota's cruelty. You flee too, but in a different direction. We meet at a predetermined place and travel east together. Ayanna considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It could work," she said slowly. "But the risks." "I know. But Ayanna, what's the alternative? You spend the rest of your life married to a monster, and your brother grows up under his influence. Is that really better than taking a chance on something different?" Before Ayanna could answer, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Ayanna's eyes went wide with terror. "Hide," she hissed, pushing James toward the rocks near the spring. "If they find you here with me, they'll kill you on the spot." James scrambled into the shadows just as 3 Apache warriors rode into the clearing. Dakota was in the lead, his face dark with suspicion. "What are you doing here, woman?" Dakota demanded in Apache. Though James didn't speak the language, the threatening tone was unmistakable. Ayana's voice was steady as she replied, but James could see her hands trembling. She gestured toward the spring and spoke rapidly in Apache, apparently explaining her presence. Dakota dismounted and walked around the clearing, clearly searching for signs that someone else had been there. He stopped just a few feet from James's hiding place and sniffed the air like a hunting animal. James held his breath, pressed against the cold rock, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it could be heard. One wrong move, one careless sound, and everything would be over. After what felt like an eternity, Dakota grunted and walked back to his horse. He said something else to Ayana, sharp and commanding. She nodded quickly and gathered up her water jug. As the riders prepared to leave, Dakota suddenly turned back to Ayana and said something in English, apparently for James's benefit, though Dakota didn't know he was there. 5 more days, woman. Then you will be mine, and we will see if you still have thoughts of white men and their picture boxes. The threat was clear. Dakota suspected James was nearby, and he wanted him to know that time was running out. After the Apache warriors rode away, Ayana waited several minutes before calling softly to James. He emerged from his hiding place, shaken by how close they had come to discovery. "This proves what I said," Ayana whispered urgently. "He is watching me constantly now. Any further contact between us is impossible." But James grabbed her hands before she could leave. "No, it proves that we're running out of time. We have to act now, before it's too late." Ayana looked into his eyes, and James could see her internal struggle. Fear warred with hope. Duty battled with desire. "If we do this thing," she said finally, "there will be no going back. Once we start, we must see it through to the end, no matter what happens." "I understand," James said solemnly. "And if we fail, if we are caught, you must promise me something. Anything. You must kill me before you let them take me back to Dakota. I would rather die free than live as his slave." Close. The word sent a chill through James's soul, but he understood what she was asking. For an Apache woman, the dishonor of capture and return would be worse than death. "I promise," he said quietly. Ayana nodded, and James saw her shoulders straighten with resolve. "Then, we will try. But we must plan carefully, and we must move fast. The ceremony is in 5 days, and after that, all hope will be lost forever." As she slipped away into the darkness, James realized that he had just committed himself to one of the most dangerous gambles of his life. But as he thought of Ayana's courage and the desperate hope he had seen in her eyes, he knew he would rather risk everything than live with the regret of doing nothing. The next 5 days would determine all their futures. The morning of the wedding ceremony dawned clear and bright, with not a cloud in the desert sky. James had spent the previous 4 days making careful preparations, studying the Apache camp's routines, and planning every detail of the dangerous rescue he was about to attempt. He had moved his base camp to a hidden canyon 5 miles from the Apache village. Close enough to reach quickly, but far enough away to avoid detection. His horse was saddled and ready, his supplies packed for a long journey east. Everything depended on perfect timing and a good measure of luck. As the sun crested the mountains, James made his way to the ridge overlooking the meadow where Little Hawk tended the horses each morning. He had observed the boy's routine for 3 days now, and it never varied. Little Hawk would arrive just before sunrise, lead the horses to graze, and then sit under a large cottonwood tree for about an hour before returning to camp. James waited, his heart pounding with anxiety. So much could go wrong. The boy might not come today. He might come with others. He might refuse to listen to James's explanation and run straight back to camp to sound the alarm. But as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold, James saw a familiar figure approaching across the meadow. Little Hawk walked with the easy confidence of youth, leading a string of horses toward the grazing area. He looked much like his sister, with the same intelligent dark eyes and graceful movements, though his face still held the roundness of childhood. James waited until Little Hawk had settled the horses and taken his usual place under the cottonwood tree. Then he stepped out from behind the rocks, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. Little Hawk jumped to his feet, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. But when he recognized James, his expression changed from alarm to curiosity. "You are the picture man," Little Hawk said in careful English. "My sister told me about you." "Yes, I'm James Patterson," James replied, relieved that the boy didn't seem afraid. "I need to talk to you about your sister." Little Hawk's eyes narrowed with sudden suspicion. "What about my sister?" "She is to be married today to Dakota." "That's exactly what I need to talk to you about," James said urgently. "Your sister is in terrible danger, and so are you. Dakota has threatened to kill you if he finds out about the friendship between your sister and me." The boy's face went pale. "What friendship? My sister would never. She met me by accident at the rapids a few weeks ago," James explained quickly. "We talked for a few hours, nothing more. But Dakota saw us together. And now he believes the worst. He's told your father that if he catches us together again, he'll kill you to punish your family." Little Hawk stared at James, processing this information. "You're telling me that I'm going to die because my sister talked to a white man?" "Not if we're smart about this," James said. "I have a plan to get you away from here. Somewhere safe where Dakota can never hurt you." "Leave my people?" Little Hawk's voice was shocked. "Leave my family? You ask me to become a wanderer with no tribe? No home?" "I'm asking you to choose life over death," James said bluntly. "Because that's the choice, boy. If you stay, Dakota will eventually find an excuse to kill you. He's that kind of man. But if you come with me, I can take you to people who will care for you, educate you, give you opportunities you could never have here." Little Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his young face troubled. "What about my sister? If I disappear, won't Dakota blame her?" "That's the beauty of the plan," James explained. "Your disappearance will happen during the wedding ceremony, when your sister is in full view of the entire tribe. No one will be able to blame her for what happens. And then she's trapped forever with that monster while I'm safe far away?" Little Hawk's voice was bitter. "That's not much of a plan, white man." James took a deep breath. This was the most dangerous part of the conversation. The part where he had to trust that Little Hawk loved his sister enough to take a huge risk. "Your sister will follow in a few weeks," he said quietly. "Once the initial search for you has died down, she'll find a way to escape too. We'll meet in a safe place and travel east together, all three of us." Little Hawk stared at him in amazement. "She agreed to this insane plan?" "She did, because she loves you enough to risk everything to keep you safe." The boy was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, he looked up at James, with eyes much older than his 14 years. "If I go with you now, and my sister doesn't escape, I'll never see her again." "That's possible," James admitted. "But if you stay, you'll likely be dead within a year. And your sister will be trapped in a miserable marriage. At least this way, there's hope for both of you." Little Hawk nodded slowly. "What do we do?" James felt a surge of relief. "First, we make it look like you ran away on your own. Take some supplies from your camp, but not too many. Leave a trail heading south, toward the deeper desert, as if you were upset about your sister's marriage and acted impulsively." "I can do that," Little Hawk said. "There's a back way into camp that's not watched during ceremony preparations. I can get what I need and be back here within an hour." "Good. But remember, once you leave that camp, there's no going back." Little Hawk squared his shoulders in a gesture that reminded James powerfully of Ayanna. "I'm sure. My sister saved my life once when I fell through ice as a child. Now, it's my turn to trust her judgment." As Little Hawk hurried back toward the Apache camp, James began the most nerve-wracking wait of his life. Everything depended on the boy's ability to get supplies and return without being noticed. If he was caught, if anyone became suspicious, the entire plan would collapse. An hour later, Little Hawk returned, carrying a small pack and his best bow and arrows. "I left signs pointing south," he reported. "Broken branches, footprints in the mud by the stream. When they search, they'll find the trail." "Perfect," James said. Now we ride hard for 3 hours, then find a place to hide until dark. The ceremony will begin at sunset. And that's when people will notice you're missing. They mounted James's horse together and rode swiftly toward the hidden canyon where James had prepared his camp. Little Hawk proved to be an excellent companion. Quick, brave, and resourceful. Despite his youth, he understood the gravity of their situation and never complained about the discomfort of riding double or the uncertainty of their future. As they rode, James found himself thinking about Ayanna. Right now, she would be going through the traditional pre-wedding preparations, probably surrounded by the women of her tribe as they helped her dress and prepared her for the ceremony. He could only imagine what she must be feeling. Knowing that in a few hours, she would be married to a man she feared and despised. Not knowing whether her brother was safe or if their desperate plan would work. By mid-afternoon, they had reached James's hidden camp. Little Hawk was impressed by the supplies. James had gathered enough food and water for several weeks of travel, extra ammunition, and even a camera to maintain James's cover as a photographer. You've been planning this for a long time, Little Hawk observed. Your sister is worth any amount of planning, James replied. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, James and Little Hawk climbed to a vantage point where they could see smoke rising from the Apache camp in the distance. The wedding ceremony would be beginning soon. I wish I could see her, Little Hawk said quietly. Just once more, to know she's all right. She's strong, James assured him. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. She'll get through this. As darkness fell, they saw torches being lit in the camp. The ceremony was underway. And somewhere in that distant glow of firelight, Ayanna was being married to Dakota. The thought made James's stomach clench with anger and helplessness. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, they saw new activity in the camp. More torches, voices calling out, horses being saddled. Little Hawk's disappearance had been discovered. They're organizing search parties, Little Hawk said, watching the distant activity. My father will be furious. He'll think I ran away because I was upset about Ayanna marrying Dakota. Which is exactly what we want them to think, James replied. Now we wait to see which direction they search first. By dawn, they could see 3 separate groups of Apache warriors riding out from the camp. 2 groups headed south, following the false trail Little Hawk had left. The third group went east, toward the white settlements, probably on Dakota's orders. No one's coming this way, James observed with relief. Our plan is working so far. They stayed hidden in the canyon for 2 more days, watching the search parties come and go. The Apache were clearly taking Little Hawk's disappearance seriously, but they seemed convinced he had fled into the deep desert in an emotional fit. On the 3rd day, James made a difficult decision. I have to go check on your sister, he told Little Hawk. I need to know she's safe and confirm the next phase of our plan. That's too dangerous, Little Hawk protested. If they catch you now, they'll know the whole thing was planned. I'll be careful, James promised. And if something goes wrong, you're to ride east without me. There's a map in my pack showing the way to Santa Fe and enough money to get you on a train to New York. You have the letter I wrote to my friend there. He'll take care of you. Little Hawk nodded reluctantly, understanding that James had to take this risk. That night, James crept to within a half-mile of the Apache camp. Using his field glasses, he could see the teepees and the central fire where people gathered. It took him nearly an hour of patient observation before he spotted Ayanna. She was sitting outside Dakota's teepee, grinding corn with the other married women. Even at this distance, James could see that something was wrong. Her movements were stiff and careful, and she held her left arm close to her body as if it hurt. As James watched, Dakota emerged from the teepee and said something to Ayanna. She didn't look up or respond, which seemed to anger him. He grabbed her hair and yanked her to her feet, causing her to drop the grinding stone. Ayanna stumbled, but managed to stay upright. James's hands clenched into fists as he watched Dakota berate his new wife in front of the other women. Several of them looked uncomfortable, but none dared to intervene. Dakota was too powerful, too dangerous to cross. When Dakota finally stalked away, Ayanna slowly knelt and picked up her grinding stone. As she did, she glanced toward the hills where James was hidden. For just a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the distance, and James saw her mouth form a silent message. 3 days. James understood. In 3 days, she would make her escape attempt. He had to be ready. James made his way back to Little Hawk and told him what he had seen. The boy was furious when he heard about Dakota's treatment of his sister. "We should kill him," Little Hawk said fiercely. "I could put an arrow through his heart from 50 yards. And then what?" James asked gently. "The whole tribe would hunt us down. Your sister would be blamed for his death. No, we stick to the plan. Patience is our only weapon right now." The next 3 days passed slowly. James and Little Hawk prepared for the next phase of their escape, checking their supplies and planning their route east. James taught the boy more English words and told him stories about life in the big cities, trying to help him imagine the new world he was entering. On the appointed night, James positioned himself at the meeting place they had agreed upon, a small grove of trees near the sacred spring where he and Ayanna had first made their plan. Little Hawk waited with the horses at a safe distance, ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. James waited for hours, growing more anxious as time passed. Had something gone wrong? Had Dakota discovered Ayanna's plan? Had she been unable to get away from the camp? Then, just before dawn, he heard soft footsteps in the darkness. Ayanna emerged from the shadows, carrying a small bundle of belongings. She moved carefully, favoring her left side, and James could see the purple bruises on her face, even in the dim light. "Thank God," James breathed, rushing to her side. "I was afraid something had happened to you." "Something did happen," Ayanna said grimly. "Dakota suspected I might try to run. He's been watching me constantly, and he made sure I understood the consequences of betrayal." She gestured to her bruised face. "How did you get away?" "I convinced him I was pregnant," Ayanna said with a bitter smile. "I told him the sacred spirits had blessed our union already, and that I needed to go to the sacred spring to make proper offerings for the health of our child. He was so pleased by the idea of an heir that he let me come alone." "But you're not really pregnant?" "No, but it bought me time. When he discovers I'm gone, he'll think I lost my mind with fear about the pregnancy. It will delay the pursuit for a few hours." James helped Ayanna toward the horses, noticing how she winced with each step. "How badly are you hurt?" "I'll live," she said simply. "The question is, will we all live long enough to reach safety? Because when Dakota realizes I've run away to be with you, he'll follow us to the ends of the earth." They reached Little Hawk, who embraced his sister joyfully, but their reunion was brief. They could already hear distant voices from the Apache camp. Ayanna's absence had been discovered sooner than expected. "We ride now," James said urgently. "Hard and fast, and we don't stop until we reach the railroad." They mounted up and spurred their horses eastward, racing against the rising sun and the vengeance of Dakota. Behind them, war whoops echoed across the desert as the Apache war party organized for pursuit. The next 6 hours were a nightmare of desperate flight across the harsh landscape. James had planned their route carefully, choosing paths that would be difficult for large groups of horsemen to follow. They splashed up streams to hide their trail, rode over rocky ground that wouldn't hold hoofprints, and changed direction frequently to confuse their pursuers. But Dakota was a skilled tracker, and his rage gave him supernatural persistence. By noon, James could see dust clouds in the distance behind them, growing steadily closer. "He's gaining on us," James told Ayanna and Little Hawk during a brief rest to water their horses. "We need to do something to slow him down." "I have an idea," Little Hawk said. "There's a narrow canyon about a mile ahead. If we can get through it, and then trigger a rock slide, we can block the passage behind us." It was a desperate gamble, but they had no choice. They pushed their exhausted horses toward the canyon, arriving just as the Apache war party came into sight behind them. The passage was barely wide enough for a single rider, with steep walls rising on both sides. As they raced through the canyon, Little Hawk explained his plan. At the far end, there was an unstable rock formation that could be brought down with carefully placed shots from James's rifle. If the timing was perfect, they could seal the passage and buy themselves hours of lead time. They reached the end of the canyon just as Dakota and his warriors entered the narrow passage behind them. James quickly took position with his rifle, aiming at the weak points in the rock wall that Little Hawk had identified. "Now!" Little Hawk shouted. James fired 3 quick shots, and the ancient rock formation shuddered and began to collapse. Tons of stone crashed down into the canyon passage, filling it completely and sealing off pursuit. They heard Dakota's scream of rage echoing off the canyon walls, but the rock slide held. It would take his warriors hours to clear the passage or find another way around. By late afternoon, they reached the railroad town of Prescott. James quickly bought tickets on the eastbound train, using false names and paying extra for a private compartment where Ayanna and Little Hawk would be less likely to attract attention. As their train pulled out of the station, Ayanna sat by the window watching the Arizona territory disappear behind them. Tears streamed down her face as she said goodbye to the only world she had ever known. "Do you regret it?" James asked gently, sitting beside her. "I regret the pain it will cause my father," Ayanna said. "I regret that I'll never see our sacred places again, or hear the old stories told around the fire. But I don't regret choosing freedom over slavery, or love over fear." Little Hawk, who had been staring in amazement at the train's interior, looked up at his sister. "What will we do in the white man's world?" "We'll learn," Ayanna said, taking his hand. "We'll adapt, the way our people always have. And we'll be together, which is what matters most." 3 months later, James stood in his friend's photography studio in New York, developing plates from his Arizona expedition. But the image that meant the most to him wasn't a landscape or a nature scene, it was a portrait of Ayanna and Little Hawk on their wedding day. Yes, their wedding day. Once they reached civilization, James and Ayanna had been married by a justice of the peace in Denver, with Little Hawk as their witness. It was a simple ceremony. Nothing like the elaborate Apache ritual Ayanna had been raised to expect, but it was real and legal, and based on love, rather than politics. Ayanna had adapted to city life with remarkable speed. Though James knew she sometimes missed the wide-open spaces of her homeland, she was learning to read and write English, and had already begun helping other immigrants navigate the complex world of American society. Little Hawk had enrolled in school and was proving to be a brilliant student, especially in mathematics and science. James's friend had welcomed him as a son, and the boy was thriving in ways that would never have been possible in the Apache camp. As for Dakota and the pursuit, they had heard nothing since leaving Arizona. James sometimes wondered if the Apache warrior was still searching for them, but as time passed, it seemed more likely that he had given up and returned to his tribe to find a new wife. One evening, as James and Ayanna sat on the porch of their new home, she pointed to a photograph of the sacred canyon where they had first met. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" she asked. James considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, I miss the beauty of that place, but I would never trade our life here for what we left behind." "Would you?" Ayanna smiled and took his hand. "Never. We chose love over law, freedom over tradition, hope over fear. Some people spend their whole lives without ever making such a choice, and some people aren't brave enough to make it when the opportunity comes," James added. As they sat together watching the sun set over their new city, James reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day when he spotted a graceful Apache woman dancing in the rapids. What had begun as a chance encounter had become a love story that defied all odds and overcame seemingly impossible obstacles. They had risked everything for each other and won. Not everyone gets such a second chance at happiness, James knew. But for those brave enough to seize it when it comes, love really can conquer all.
Thomas woke before dawn to the sound of silence. After 3 days of howling wind and driving snow, the sudden quiet felt almost unnatural. He sat up in his chair and looked toward the windows, where the first pale light of morning was beginning to filter through the heavy curtains. The storm had finally passed. Ayanna was still sleeping peacefully on the sofa, her breathing deep and regular. The color had returned fully to her face, and she no longer showed any signs of the hypothermia that had nearly claimed her life. Thomas quietly added wood to the fire and put water on to boil for coffee, moving carefully to avoid waking her Dot as he prepared breakfast. Thomas found himself thinking about the day ahead. The storm was over, which meant they could begin searching for Ayana's brother. But he also knew that after 3 days in this brutal cold, the chances of finding him alive were slim. Still, he had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. Ayana stirred as the smell of bacon and coffee filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, testing her strength, and Thomas was pleased to see that she moved with much of her natural grace restored. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The storm has stopped." "Yes, it broke about an hour ago," Thomas replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "How are you feeling?" Ayana took a sip of the coffee and considered the question. "Much better, weak still, but better. My body feels like my own again." She paused, looking toward the windows. "We can search today?" Thomas nodded. "As soon as you're strong enough to ride. But Ayana, I need you to understand something. It's been 3 days since you were separated from your brother. The conditions out there have been—" "I know," Ayana interrupted quietly. "I know what 3 days in this cold means. But I cannot abandon him without trying. He is only 16 years old, and he is all the family I have left." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and Thomas felt his heart go out to her. He had lost family members himself during the war, and he understood the desperate need to know what had happened, even when the truth might be unbearable. "We'll find him," Thomas said simply. "One way or another, we'll find him." After breakfast, Thomas helped Ayana into some of his warmer clothes for the search. His spare coat was too large for her, but she managed to make it work by rolling up the sleeves and cinching the belt tight around her waist. He also gave her a warm hat and gloves and a pair of boots that, while too big, would keep her feet dry and warm. Before they left the cabin, Ayana asked if she could prepare something. From a small pouch that had survived the storm, she produced several dried herbs and asked Thomas if she could use some hot water to make what she called a strength tea. She explained that it was a traditional Apache remedy used by hunters and warriors before long journeys. As she worked, Thomas watched her movements with interest. Her hands were sure and skilled as she measured and mixed the herbs, and he could see the deep knowledge and tradition behind every action. When she offered him some of the tea, he accepted gratefully. It had a strong, earthy taste with hints of mint and something else he couldn't identify, and within minutes he felt more alert and energized. "That's remarkable," he said. "What's in it?" "Many things that grow in the desert," Ayana replied with a slight smile. "My grandmother taught me that the land provides everything we need if we know how to look for it." They set out on horseback as soon as the sun was fully up. Thomas had saddled his most reliable horse for Ayana and chosen his strongest mount. For himself, knowing that the search might take them far from the cabin. The snow was deep in places, particularly where it had drifted against rocks and trees. But both horses were experienced in difficult terrain. Ayana guided them toward the area where she had last seen her brother. Despite the blanket of snow that covered everything, she seemed to have an innate sense of direction that impressed Thomas. She would stop occasionally to examine the landscape, looking for landmarks that the storm hadn't obscured. "There," she said finally, pointing toward a line of cottonwood trees along what was clearly a dry creek bed. "We were following the creek when the storm became too strong. Mateo wanted to continue, but I insisted we find shelter. We argued about it." Her voice broke slightly. Our last words to each other were spoken in anger. Thomas guided his horse closer to hers. "Siblings always argue," he said gently. "It doesn't mean you didn't love each other." They followed the creek bed for nearly 2 miles, searching for any sign of tracks or disturbance in the snow. The cold had been so severe that even the creek, which Thomas had never seen completely frozen, was solid ice beneath the white covering. It was Ayana who spotted the first sign. A piece of dark blue cloth caught on a mesquite bush, fluttering like a small flag in the wind. She dismounted quickly and examined it closely. "This is from Mateo's shirt," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "He was wearing a blue cotton shirt that our grandmother made for him." Thomas examined the area around the bush more carefully. The snow was disturbed here, with what might have been tracks leading away from the creek toward higher ground. But after 3 days and the wind from the storm, it was impossible to be certain. They continued following the vague trail up a steep slope, dotted with large boulders and hardy desert plants. The horses had to work hard in the deep snow, and both riders had to dismount and lead their animals through the most difficult sections. Near the top of the ridge, Ayana suddenly stopped and called out in Apache. Her voice echoed across the empty landscape, but there was no response. She called again, this time in English. "Mateo, Mateo, where are you?" Thomas watched her face as she strained to hear any reply. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind whistling through the rocks. But then, faintly, they heard something that might have been a voice, or might have been just an echo from the wind. "Did you hear that?" Ayana asked urgently. Thomas listened carefully. There it was again, a sound that definitely wasn't natural. "Something's there," he confirmed. "It's coming from beyond those rocks?" They hurried forward, leading their horses around the large outcropping. On the other side, they found what looked like a natural shelter formed by several large boulders leaning against each other. And huddled inside, barely visible under a covering of snow and debris, was a human figure. "Mateo!" Ayana cried out, rushing forward. The figure moved slightly at the sound of her voice, and Thomas could see that it was indeed a young man, probably no older than Ayana had said. But he was in bad shape. His lips were blue, his skin was pale and waxy, and his movements were slow and confused. "Ayana?" the young man whispered. I thought you were dead." "No, my brother, I'm here," Ayana said, kneeling beside him and pulling him into her arms. "I'm here, and we're going to get you somewhere warm." Thomas quickly assessed the situation. Mateo was suffering from severe exposure, just as his sister had been, but he had managed to find some shelter that had probably saved his life. The space between the rocks had protected him from the worst of the wind and snow, and he had apparently used branches and other debris to create additional insulation. "Smart boy," Thomas said to Ayana. "He made himself a survival shelter. That's probably what kept him alive." Working together, they got Mateo onto Thomas's horse, with Ayana riding behind to support him. Thomas led both horses while walking alongside, setting a pace that would get them back to the cabin quickly without exhausting the animals. During the journey back, Mateo drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he spoke in a mixture of Apache and broken English, telling them about the storm, about losing the horses, about the terrible cold. He had survived by moving constantly during the days and huddling in whatever shelter he could find at night. "I knew Ayana would come for me," he said weakly. "I knew she wouldn't leave me out there." When they reached the cabin, Thomas and Ayana worked together to warm and care for Mateo using the same methods that had saved Ayana's life. The young man was in worse condition than his sister had been, having spent more time exposed to the elements, but he was conscious and responsive, which were good signs. As Mateo gradually warmed up, Thomas had the opportunity to observe the interaction between the siblings. Despite the fact that their last conversation had been an argument, it was clear that they cared deeply for each other. Ayana was gentle, but firm in caring for her brother, and Mateo, even in his weakened state, showed a mature concern for how his sister had survived. "You said your last words were spoken in anger," Thomas observed to Ayana as they prepared dinner that evening. "But I can see that anger was born from love and worry." Ayana nodded thoughtfully. "Apache families are taught that we are responsible for each other. When Mateo wanted to continue in the storm, I was afraid for him. My fear made me speak harshly." "And yet he knew you would come for him," Thomas pointed out. "That tells me he understood your fear came from love." Over the next 2 days, both siblings regained their strength under Thomas's care. During this time, the three of them had many conversations about their different ways of life, their beliefs, and their experiences on the frontier. Thomas learned more about Apache culture than he had in all his previous interactions with the tribe. Ayana and Mateo told him about their traditional ways of living in harmony with the desert, their methods of finding water and food in the harshest candidi. 6 months after that bitter winter storm had brought them together, Thomas Mitchell stood on the porch of his cabin and surveyed the changes that had transformed his ranch. What had once been a simple cattle operation struggling to survive in the harsh desert environment had become something entirely different. A thriving example of what could be accomplished when two very different ways of understanding the land work together. The most visible change was the series of terraced gardens that now stretched along the south side of his property. Using traditional Apache knowledge of water conservation and desert agriculture, Ayanna had helped him design a system that captured and channeled every precious drop of rainfall. Where once there had been only scrub brush and rocky soil, now grew corn, beans, squash, and a variety of desert plants that provided both food and medicine. The cattle operation had also been revolutionized. Mateo's knowledge of seasonal grazing patterns and natural water sources had allowed Thomas to expand his herd while actually reducing the stress on the land. The young Apache man had shown him pasture areas he had never known existed, hidden valleys where the grass grew thick and nutritious, and springs that ran clear even in the driest months, but the changes went far beyond mere agricultural improvements. The partnership had brought something to Thomas's life that he hadn't even realized he was missing, a sense of community and purpose that went beyond simple survival. As he watched Ayanna emerging from the garden with a basket of fresh vegetables, Thomas reflected on how naturally they had all fallen into their new arrangement. The initial weeks had not been without challenges. When Ayanna and Mateo had first returned from explaining the situation to their tribe, they had brought with them news that the Apache elders were deeply divided about the wisdom of such close cooperation with a white settler. Some had seen it as a betrayal of traditional ways and an unnecessary risk. Others, particularly the older members who remembered the peaceful trading relationships of earlier times, had supported the idea as a path toward a more secure future. The debate had been intense, with several heated council meetings, but eventually the siblings had been given permission to proceed, though with the understanding that they would be closely watched by their people. Similar challenges had come from the white community. When word had spread that Thomas was working closely with Apache partners, reactions had ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. Some of his neighbors had accused him of being naive or even traitorous. Others had worried that he was encouraging Indian raids or setting a dangerous precedent. The situation had come to a head 3 months into their partnership when a group of concerned settlers had ridden to his ranch for what they called a friendly visit, but which was clearly intended as a confrontation. Thomas remembered that day vividly, 8 armed men arriving unannounced, demanding to know what he thought he was doing and insisting that he send the Apache siblings away. The confrontation might have turned ugly if not for an incident that perfectly illustrated the value of the partnership Thomas had formed. During the tense conversation in his yard, one of the visitors' horses had suddenly collapsed, showing clear signs of severe colic. The animal was in agony, rolling on the ground and clearly in danger of dying. Thomas had been at a loss, knowing little about treating such conditions, but Ayanna had immediately stepped forward. Working with calm efficiency, she had prepared a traditional Apache remedy from plants growing wild around the ranch. Within an hour, the horse had recovered completely, standing and eating normally as if nothing had happened. The incident had dramatically shifted the attitude of several visitors. The man whose horse had been saved, a rancher named William Hayes, had publicly thanked Ayanna and admitted that he had been wrong to prejudge her abilities. Word of the healing had spread quickly through the settler community, and Thomas had begun to receive visits from neighbors seeking Ayanna's help with sick livestock and other problems. These early successes had led to something neither Thomas nor the Apache siblings had originally envisioned. Their ranch was becoming a bridge between two communities that had previously regarded each other with suspicion and fear. Apache families had begun visiting regularly, not just to check on Ayanna and Mateo, but also to trade with Thomas and learn about his techniques. Similarly, more and more white settlers were overcoming their initial prejudices and coming to see the practical benefits of the partnership. The economic advantages alone were substantial. Thomas's improved understanding of the local environment, gained through Apache knowledge, had allowed him to increase his cattle herd by 40% while maintaining healthier grazing conditions. The diverse crops growing in the terrace gardens provided food security and a new source of income. Through sales to other ranches and the growing town of Willow Creek, Ayanna's skills as a healer had also created an unexpected source of revenue. Her reputation for successfully treating both humans and animals had spread throughout the territory, and people traveled considerable distances to seek her help. She had established a small clinic in one of Thomas's outbuildings where she treated everything from broken bones to difficult pregnancies. But perhaps more important than the economic benefits were the relationships that had developed. Thomas had discovered that Matteo possessed a natural talent for understanding cattle behavior that surpassed his own hard-won experience. The young man could predict when animals were likely to stray, when they were getting sick, and when they were ready for breeding with an accuracy that amazed experienced ranchers. Ayana's contributions went beyond healing and agriculture. Her deep understanding of weather patterns, learned from generations of Apache tradition, had helped Thomas avoid several potential disasters. She had predicted the late spring flood that had caught other ranchers by surprise, allowing them to move their cattle to higher ground in advance. She had also forecast the early frosts that had damaged crops throughout the territory, enabling them to harvest their gardens before any loss occurred. The partnership had also brought unexpected personal fulfillment to all three participants. Thomas had found in Ayana and Matteo not just business partners but genuine friends who shared his love for the land and his determination to succeed despite the challenges. The loneliness that had been a constant companion during his years of solitary ranching had been replaced by a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. For Ayana and Matteo, the arrangement had provided opportunities they could never have had within the traditional boundaries of either Apache or white society. Ayana's skills as a healer were reaching a broader community than ever before, and she was learning new techniques from the white settlers' medical knowledge that enhanced her traditional remedies. Matteo was gaining experience with modern ranching methods while contributing his own expertise in animal husbandry. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first anniversary of their meeting during that terrible storm, Thomas realized that their experimental partnership had evolved into something much more significant. They were proving that cooperation between very different peoples was not only possible but could be mutually beneficial in ways none of them had originally imagined. The success had not gone unnoticed by the broader community. Delegations from other Apache bands had visited to observe their operation and consider whether similar arrangements might work elsewhere. Several white ranchers had also approached Thomas about the possibility of establishing partnerships with Native American families in their areas. Perhaps most significantly, the territorial government had taken notice of their success. A representative from the territorial capital had visited the ranch and spoken extensively with all three partners about their methods and achievements. The official had expressed interest in promoting similar cooperative arrangements as a model for peaceful development throughout the region. The visit from the government representative had led to an unexpected invitation. All three had been asked to travel to the territorial capital to speak before a special committee studying relationships between settlers and Native American tribes. The invitation was both an honor and a responsibility that none of them had anticipated. As they prepared for the journey, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed since that cold winter day when he had found Ayana nearly frozen in the snow. What had begun as a simple act of human compassion had grown into something that might have implications far beyond their individual lives. The trip to the capital took 3 days by wagon, traveling through country that all three knew well but had never seen from this perspective, as representatives of a new way of thinking about the relationship between peoples who had often been enemies. During the long journey, they had time to discuss what they would say to the committee. Each brought a different perspective to the conversation. Thomas spoke from the viewpoint of a practical rancher who had discovered that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Ayana emphasized the Apache belief that the land belonged to everyone and that different peoples could live on it together if they learned to understand each other. Matteo, despite his youth, had developed sophisticated ideas about how traditional knowledge and modern techniques could be combined to solve problems that neither see